A warm welcome, everybody, from the Bali in Amsterdam. We're celebrating here with the Forum on European Culture, which unfortunately, because of COVID restrictions and public health requirements, cannot be in person, but we're very, very happy to see so many people joining online and to welcome you to a conversation about Europe from an outsider's perspective. I think it's always very refreshing to zoom out. In Europe, we can be a bit inward focused from time to time, and the world is changing rapidly around Europe, so there's undoubtedly a lot to say about what Europe looks like from the outside. And I'm very, very happy to welcome two distinguished speakers to join our session today. Taslima Nasrin, she is joining us from Delhi, but she is from Bangladesh herself. She has lived in Europe, in the United States, is a very well-known author, human rights activist, feminist, and Islam critic, and there's a lot more we could say about her, but I think that these are some of the key points about who she is. And then from Singapore, Kishore Mahbubani, a well-known author, former diplomat and political scientist who focuses on geopolitical relations and analysis of the West and China most recently. A warm welcome to both of you. Also want to welcome the online audience and let you know that via Slido, and the information about how exactly this is done will appear on your screen. You can feel free to send in some questions and we will try to get to those towards the end of our discussion. But to kick us off, and maybe Kishore, I can start with you. COVID has changed a lot, but there were already shifts in geopolitical relations happening, and the trends will undoubtedly continue. What does Europe look like from where you sit?
It's actually very surprising to many of us who live in the rest of the world how badly Europe has done in response to COVID-19. And I say this as a friend of Europe. I mean, and there's one statistic which is very puzzling. If you look at the number of deaths per million from COVID-19, per million of population, in East Asia, in virtually all countries, from China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, is less than 10. In Europe, which, and European societies are far more advanced, far more developed, are much richer, have better medical facilities. The deaths from COVID-19 are in the hundreds. In Belgium, it's like almost 800. And see the gap? Less than 10, 800. So the question that many Asians are asking is, what happened? Why did some of the world's most competent societies perform so badly in response to COVID-19? And of course, we don't know the answer. And I think it's also a mistake for East Asians to become complacent, by the way. We should never become complacent. But I think this is a time for Europe to do some serious reflection on whether or not it needs to step back and ask itself a very simple, basic question, which is that Europe has always been used to lecturing the rest of the world, telling the rest of the world what to do. Is it time now for Europe to start listening to the rest of the world, and especially learning lessons from the rest of the world, and maybe learning lessons from East Asia? And I say this as a friend of Europe. We want Europe to do well. And we think it'd be good for Europeans to learn to be a bit more humble when it comes to dealing with the world.
Well, one area where Europeans tend to take on an ambitious role or a leadership role, or at least used to, is in the field of universal human rights. And I can well imagine that some countries or some governments or some people in other parts of the world have felt lectured at. How do you see this, Taslima? Do you think that Europe lives up to its role as a defender of human rights? You've been confronted with serious threats and had to leave your home country as a result. You've spent time in Europe. What are your thoughts on that specific role of Europe?
I think that it's a very good role that Europe is playing. Persecuted writers like me, we have no other alternative but to go to Europe to save our lives. Europe is a safe haven till now. And for Europe always uphold its ideas, that human rights, women's equal rights, the democracy, freedom of speech, but we don't see it, these ideals in other countries, especially in Asia and Middle East. So Europe is always safe haven for the people who need free speech, who are persecuted, who are political refugees. I am actually a Swedish citizen, even though I decided to come to India and write for the subcontinent people. But when I lived in Sweden, Germany, France, and also I visited many countries, I loved Europe. And I think that it's much better than United States of America, actually much better than any other countries. But always I want to tell, people, especially European countries, that it's wonderful that you defend human rights, but I think that this multiculturalism issue is not quite all right when you say that you have to respect all cultures, because all cultures are not morally equal. Some cultures are inferior to others. Suppose female genital mutilation. We don't have to respect that culture, because that culture is a very misogynistic, inferior culture. This kind of polygamy, female genital mutilation, child marriage, wife beating, these kind of things people are doing in Europe. So I think that Europe needs to control this kind of anti-women activities. And otherwise, for for free speech, for democracy, Europe is still wonderful.
Well, it's interesting that you touch upon the tensions there that are very much part of the debate also in Europe. How can the liberties be preserved and what might be the threats to it, and how can Europe remain credible when it comes to human rights? And one area where that discussion is very heated is when it comes to migration. And Kishore, you've mentioned in the past that you believe that contrary to the United States, which is very focused on China, and legitimately so, that Europeans should focus much more as a sort of priority issue on how to deal with the tensions in the Islamic world around it, essentially the Middle East, Northern Africa. What are your thoughts about this dynamic and how Europe should deal with its priorities vis-a-vis its neighborhood?
Well,
Europe. Sorry, is Kishoreji?
Yes.
He will
Kishore,
answer, or I should?
Yeah, let me go to Kishore and then I can come back to you as well.
Okay,
I think it's relevant for both of you.
thank you. I must say, I want to completely agree with Taslima in saying that I share her admiration for Europe. I mean, if you look around the world and you ask yourself, leaving aside the COVID-19 bad performance, overall, if you're looking for societies that have taken good care of the people, that provide social justice, that take care of the people who are poor, I think clearly the European societies are far ahead of the United States. And in fact, in my book, which I'll speak about later, Has China Won?, I describe how the United States of America has become effectively a plutocracy. In theory, democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. But as the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz has said, the United States has become a country of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And the data shows this, by the way. So clearly, Europe is doing some things fundamentally right in a way that United States isn't. But this brings me to a critical point when it comes to the issue of human rights. You show your courage in defending human rights, not when you kick people who are weaker than you. So it's very easy to criticize Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe because what the hell? What can Mugabe do to you? You can criticize him, you can slap him, he can't do anything to you. But the real test of your commitment to human rights comes when you have to take a stand where you have to show some courage, where you have to stand up to a real bully at some risk to yourself. And I must congratulate Taslima. She has taken huge risks to defend human rights personally. She's shown real courage. And Europe had the opportunity to show this courage after 9/11, because after 9/11, as you know, and which is an unjustified attack, I was in Manhattan in 9/11. I know how shocked the Americans were. It was perfectly justified when they invaded Afghanistan to attack Al-Qaeda. But after that, when they caught various Muslim extremists, they tortured them. And torture is against one of the most fundamental denial of human rights. And I expected the European countries, European governments to criticize and attack the United States for being the first modern developed country to resume torture. And till today, I'm shocked that not one European government, not one, has gone on record officially to criticize the United States for being the first country to practice torture. And that, frankly, brought down Europe's status in the world significantly, because you don't show your courage when you criticize poorer, weaker countries. You show your courage when you criticize stronger countries. And when coming back to your question about the Middle East and the Islamic world, I think Taslima is a bigger expert on the Islamic world than I am. But I would say the Islamic world, to put it very simply, is a very troubled place. Very deeply troubled. It's got many existential challenges. But the way you deal with these challenges is to try and work with the countries and not to try and invade and occupy countries. And you know, the United States invasion of Iraq was completely illegal. And the end result was an Iraq that was far worse. And every time the United States, and unfortunately in some cases like in Libya, it was Europe and the United States intervening in Libya. It was a good thing to remove Gaddafi, but then after that you left total chaos down there. So, and I say this because, you know, Libya doesn't affect us, but Libya affects Europe directly. Libya is so near. So what I advocate, therefore, for the West to do with the Middle East and with the Islamic world is adopt a more patient, long-term strategy. And the one thing you could do is ask yourself, in which parts of the world are the Islamic societies succeeding and which parts are they not? And paradoxically, the Islamic societies closest to Europe, and you can go from Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, they're not succeeding. By contrast, the Islamic societies in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei are succeeding. They're not perfect. But, you know, they're reducing poverty, they're providing education, they're providing healthcare, and there are no refugees leaving Indonesia, no refugees leaving Malaysia, no refugees leaving Brunei. So if Europe can try to replicate what we in Southeast Asia have done in North Africa, then Europe will be a much more secure place. And as you know, even Dutch politics has been distorted because the arrival of all these Muslim migrants, some of whom have been extremists, as you know, has created a much stronger far-right political movement in Europe. So your politics is being distorted by these countries. And so I, as somebody, and I want to protect and defend Europe because Europe is an ideal for the world, Europe should intervene more intelligently in the Islamic world.
What do you think, Taslima? More patience with the countries around Europe, or how do you think Europe should navigate this big challenge of openness versus a defensive
sometimes
posture?
when we see that, the Muslims, refugees, Sweden and Germany gave shelter to so many refugees from Syria and Iraq. 1 million refugees arrived to Germany, and I don't know, more than 100,000 refugees arrived in Sweden, and they were so generous that they welcomed all the refugees, even though they knew that they could be, many of them could be extremists. But this generosity, this is also important when the people didn't know where to go. And this very interesting thing is that the Muslim countries, even though they say about Muslim Brotherhood, but how many Muslim countries actually gave shelter to those refugees? Actually, European countries gave shelter. And this, till now, in the world, is most generous countries are in Europe. So, for human rights, for free speech, I always admire this European country. But anyway, what I think that we have seen that there are some extremists, misogynists among the refugees. So I think that Europe should decide how to handle them. Because if in the name of human rights, if they can get all, freedom to all kinds of anti-women activities, and also if they can get chance to practice their misogyny, it's not good for Europe. When Charlie Hebdo's journalists were killed by terrorists in Paris, I was afraid to go to Paris for many years, because I could be killed by any terrorist there. So I never could imagine before that Europe could be, this kind of unsafe place ever. But it is true now, the terrorist activities we have seen in UK, in Belgium, in France, in Germany. So, because, this is the result of the too much generosity. But I think that Europe can control that. Okay, Europe should be generous, kind towards people, but extremism should be controlled. And in the name of culture, all inferior cultures, no kind of religious fundamentalism should be allowed, because the people first, they become religious and they start going to mosques, then they become religious fundamentalists, and they become religious terrorists. I think that secular Europe should be secular and should remain secular.
How do you think that should be done? Because it's hard to see it from someone's face when they are at the border as a refugee what's on their minds, or how their minds might change as they come into a country. What are your thoughts on how Europe can do this?
I don't know. I think that oh, sorry.
No. Okay, I just add something here, because I agree with you, Taslima, that it's good for Europe to be so generous, to be also open. But at the same time, we neither you nor I want to destroy Europe. My previous book, it was called "Has the West Lost It?" And when it was published in France, Hubert Védrine, the former French foreign minister, wrote a foreword for it. And I had a discussion with him, and I said the most sensible thing that Europe can do now to protect itself is to press the pause button on migration and say, for 5 years, no more migrants. Because right now, European societies are being torn apart. They're being literally torn apart by the issue of migration. Why is the UK leaving Europe? Why? The British want to preserve their identity. They don't want foreigners. And in the same way, by the way, why did Donald Trump win the elections in the United States? He told the American people, no more Mexicans. I will build a wall for you, right? So there's a limit to what any society has a limit to how many migrants it can take. And clearly, Europe has taken in too many migrants in too short a time. And that's distorting European politics and frankly, destroying the societies that we idealize in the rest of the world. So we should help Europe by saying, press the pause button. Now, this may go against all the human
I
rights
don't agree with the pause button.
I think that's the best way to that's the best way to protect Europe from becoming divided and polarized. And we don't want Europe to end up in the same way as the United States and elect a Donald Trump. But that's what will happen if you don't stop too many migrants coming in.
Taslima, you don't agree. Why?
I don't agree to, stop migration. Let people like me who are, persecuted in their own countries, and then, the Islamic fundamentalists wanted to kill me. There was, many fatwas were issued against me. Where can I go? Europe is the safe haven. Europe is people like me, in Bangladesh, many atheists, free thinkers were hacked to death. And then some of the atheists and free thinkers had to leave the country, otherwise they would be killed. So where they would go? Europe. Europe is the place only for them, where they can use their free, they can say whatever they wanted to say. Europe is still the place where we can say whatever we want to say. But in Asia, in India is the largest democracy in the world. We cannot say what we want to say. Here,
Taslima, let me emphasize one point. I completely agree with you. Those who are escaping from persecution, those who are being attacked like you, Europe should provide asylum. I completely agree with that. But you're not talking about the few individuals like you. You're talking about millions of economic migrants who are basically leaving because of poverty and deprivation. So that's a different, and there are other solutions for these people suffering from poverty and migration, and you've got to help them develop their societies so they stay at home. And frankly, one of the big success stories we've had in Southeast Asia is that we used to be one of the poorest regions in the world in Southeast Asia. Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch for, I don't know how, over 100 years. So it was very poor as any other developing part of the world. But Indonesia doesn't send out any migrants. Why not? Because they're developed.
Let me pick up on a point that both of you mentioned, which is basically the radicalization process. And you mentioned, Kishore, 9/11 and how after that, a lot of norms when it came to preserving the freedoms that were actually attacked by the terrorists became eroded. We can see very clearly now, particularly in the United States, that increasingly there's also radicalization, the picking up of arms by civilians on the far right and on the right. And also in Europe, we can see right-wing politics on the rise. How does that look from where you sit? Do you think it's a vindication of nationalism that you've also seen in Asia and other parts of the world? Or is it also something that troubles you when it comes to your hopes and expectations of Europe? And the United States, sorry, I should say the West, basically.
Well, I would, by the way, make a big distinction between still the United States and Europe, by the way. They're very different dynamics. And Europe, overall, by the way, is still in a better place than United States is. Because the United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period, It's actually quite shocking to see how badly off the people at the bottom have been. And that's a result of what I call the plutocracy that you see that's developed in the United States. And there's no plutocracy in Europe, so you're much better off. So I actually believe that the socio-economic conditions are the fundamental drivers for the polarization that you see happening in the United States. And frankly, if I was living in Europe, I'd pay very, very careful attention to what's happening in the United States. And you would ask, what is it we can do to prevent that from coming here. But fortunately, the societies in Europe, most of them, then are more democratic socialists. You have higher taxes, you have social security, you take care of your poor. So you're obviously much more socially just societies in Europe than you have in the United States. So I would say the important thing is for Europe to ask itself, what do we do to ensure that we never have a Donald Trump being elected? That would be like Marine Le Pen being elected president of France.
Is it socioeconomic, or is it also about identity, Taslima? How do you see this far-right politics evolving?
This is really a very bad situation that far-right politics is becoming popular in Europe, where we saw socialists or social democrats were popular. Now the situation is changing. This is now I think that the failure of left politics, leftist is the reason, because leftists very unfortunately defended Islamists, Islamic fundamentalism, and sometimes Islamic terrorism. And because Islamic terrorists or Islamic fundamentalists, they are not, they don't support the leftists. They are actually, their ideology is a very far-right ideology. How come leftists defend them? And because leftists defend all these Islamic fundamentalism, I think that this is the reason that far-right politics is becoming so popular.
How do they defend them?
The leftists are not there to fight far-right politics.
But can you say a little bit?
Leftist character is totally,
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by defending extremists? Because I hear a clear tension between your perspective. Kishore says social democrats have basically created an socioeconomic safety net, which creates more resiliency in Europe, whereas Taslima says the left, and I would love to hear more about where you begin to define the left, is responsible for the counter arguments on the right side, essentially by turning a blind eye to extremists in their own societies or who came in as refugees. So what do you mean exactly by what the left has done, Taslima?
Left, because the Muslims are oppressed by the West. Leftists think that way, and because Islam is criticized, so leftists actually defend Islam for being criticized by the Western people. So this way, actually, they defend the Islamic ideology, which is very much anti-human rights, anti-women rights, anti-democracy, anti-free speech. So I think that leftists, they criticize all kinds of fundamentalism, like Christian fundamentalists, Jewish fundamentalists, all other fundamentalists. Why not Islamic fundamentalism? I think they should have done that. They should have done that. So the far right, because of the Islamic terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, European people actually trusted the far-right politics, because far-right politics is against immigration, against Muslims, against Islam. So of course they think that Europe will be saved by right-wing far-right politics. But actually leftists should have done much better, instead of defending those anti-human rights ideology.
Let me pick up at the point of human rights and how it's being eroded, how it's under pressure, and kind of elevated to the global perspective, Kishore. You've written a lot about China. Behind you, we can see your book, Has China Won? What is your verdict? What is your analysis of the human rights situation globally and the role that China plays domestically, but also globally. I mean, is the rise of China of a decisive impact on the chances for universal human rights, or is there a counter voice that balances it out?
Well, thank you. Thank you for mentioning my book, because I was going to mention the Dutch edition of Has China Won is going to be released in Amsterdam in a month, I think. And I was hoping to obviously come to Amsterdam to launch it, but now it doesn't look possible because of COVID-19. But the thesis of the book is that there's absolutely no question that over the next 10 to 20 years, the world will be a very troubled place. And the world will be a very troubled place because we are going to see, we've already seen the start of it, but we're going to see the acceleration of one of the biggest geopolitical contests that we have ever seen in human history. And by the way, this is a 2,000-year rule of geopolitics, okay? And Graham Allison of Harvard has written a book called Destined for War, in which he talks about, for 2,000 years, whenever the world's number one emerging power, today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, today is United States, the number one power always pushes down the number two power without fail, okay? With one exception, when the British gave way to the United States. So that geopolitical contest is happening. But that's a contest that's happening across many dimensions, economics, politics, and also in the cultural and human rights dimension that you speak about. And it would actually, we would all love to see the ideals of the United States of protecting of human rights remain strong. But unfortunately, when it comes to protecting human rights, this is not a big secret. The United States has double standards of a very extreme kind. Just today, when I was talking to Shashi Tharoor on a different program, Shashi Tharoor was saying that who killed Jamal Khashoggi? And the United States didn't care. It didn't matter. He pretended as though Jamal Khashoggi never happened. And so in the case of the protection of human rights, the biggest challenge is how do we integrate China into this world? Because if China is not part of the solution, China becomes part of the problem. And my basic argument in that book is that the West is trying very hard to see how we can transform China and make China in its own image and make China a liberal democratic society. Now, of course, if it can happen, fine, it'd be great. But in life, there are some realities you cannot change. And in geopolitics, the most important job of a geopolitical analyst is to engage in realism. What can be changed and what cannot be changed? And in the case of China, as I say in the book, one reason why the Americans are so disappointed with China, and by the way, a good friend of mine, a State Department official, Kirk Campbell, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs saying this, that when the United States engaged China, the Americans believed that when the United States opened up China economically, and after they opened up China economically, China would open up politically, and then China would become like the United States, a liberal democracy. And this was a widely held expectation. But when future historians look at this expectation, they'll be very puzzled. They say, how is it this young republic, United States, with 1/4 the population of China, 1/4, thought that when the United States engages China, and China's got 4 times the population and 4,000 years of history, the United States would change China rather than China change the United States. So it's not going to happen. So the question is, how do you work with China, and how do you work with China in a way that doesn't destabilize the world and doesn't trouble the world? And let me add a very, very important fact here, which actually so few Europeans know, and so few Americans know. Everybody assumes that since China is run by the Chinese Communist Party, it's a fact, all communist parties are oppressive. And so the only reason why the Chinese Communist Party is succeeding is because it is sitting on top of the Chinese people. But you know, the Harvard Kennedy School, just a month ago, came out with a study, a 15-year study, studying what are the levels of support of the Chinese people for the Chinese Communist Party. This is a Harvard Kennedy School study that shows, and it plots it, over the last 15 years, support for the Chinese Communist Party has gone up from 83% to 95% for the Chinese Communist Party. Why? Because the past 40 years of socio-economic development in China for the Chinese people, especially for the bottom 50% in China, the past 40 years have been the best 4,000 years. So the Chinese people are therefore not the oppressed people that the Europeans describe, but they're developing their own experiment and development. And we may not like it, but that's their choice. And if you're going to try and change it, you'll fail. So you've got to see how you can work with them.
Where do you think India fits into this reshuffling of geopolitical power and agency and the future of democracy particularly?
Well, India, I must say, if you had asked me this question 2 months ago, I would have been quite optimistic that India would play a very useful, neutral, balancing role between United States and China, you know, to be an independent voice and try to, you know, nudge both of them. But after what happened on June 15th, you know, there were clashes at the Himalayan border and lots of Indian soldiers were killed. India has been swept by anti-China sentiment, and India is moving closer to the United States. And I think India will become, in practical terms, serve as an ally of the United States against China. But I would say temporarily, because at some point in time, and sort of Shashi Tharoor sort of hinted at this today, at the end of the day, India will not, as he said, I'm quoting him now, India will not join a containment policy against China, but India thinks China should be constrained. And my answer to him, yes, the best way to constrain China is with multilateral rules and norms and processes. Mm-hmm.
Taslima, you are in India right now. How is your experience there? There's a lot of questions about the democratic values in India. You already mentioned repression of critical voices, the position of women in India. What is your observation there?
You know, so far in this South Asia, I think that India is doing good. India is a democracy. Okay, I would not say that women get equality or, you know, or everybody can enjoy freedom of expression. It's not here. But still it is better than other neighboring countries. You know, Pakistan, there is no free speech. In Bangladesh, almost no democracy, no free speech. But India, at least we can you know, say whatever we, not probably the 100% you know, freedom to speak our mind, but at least much better. And now it's okay. I think here is the problem is that even though it's a democracy, it's the constitution is secular constitution, but here Muslim minority, they have their own Muslim laws, which actually, you know, there should be uniform civil code based on equality, but Muslims do not want to have any equality between men and women. They want their Quranic laws. So they have kind of Sharia laws here. So that we cannot say that India is totally 100% secular country. So their problems are there, of course, but I think that things should be better. Today, 9 Al-Qaeda terrorists were arrested in India. So there are terrorists also here, not only in Europe or not only in the Middle East. So
it's
here,
a global
where
problem.
But it's a big threat.
Are you able to do your work now to say what you want to say, to fight for the rights that you want to fight for from India, or are you still careful or not feeling safe?
Much better in Europe and America, but India, I chose India because women are oppressed here, so I can, be here and speak for them, fight for their rights, and human rights is violated. So I can talk about human rights. I can talk about free speech. So I thought that as a European citizen, because I cannot go back to my country. It's 26 years that I have been living in exile. I'm forced to live in exile. But in Europe, I could speak whatever I, wanted to speak. So it is better if I can work here and give the voice to especially women who cannot speak their mind, and also who are oppressed. So I really fight against oppression. I really fight against all kinds of human rights violation. And during this lockdown, 2 books were published. One is Shameless, another is My Girlhood. So I have written 45 books, so I think that I will continue my writings without any kind of compromise. And I am not against Islamic fundamentalism. I am against all kinds of religious fundamentalism. And I am against misogyny and women's oppression. I think that it is the best place for me, India, where I can,
there's surely a lot of work.
Encourage women to fight for their rights and freedom.
Yeah, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And of course, the world today lost an icon for equal rights and the position of women in the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the United States, which I think is not only a loss in terms of the equality battle, but also really puts in a different spotlight the whole electoral race for the White House and the presidential elections. So perhaps we can spend the last part of this conversation talking about what is at stake in November. Kishore, do you want to reflect a little bit on that? And perhaps we can then circle back to Europe, because it strikes me that we've been talking about geopolitics, we've been talking about changing relations, the role of China and India, and we haven't talked much about Europe, even though we're here also to reflect back. But perhaps the fact that there's so much happening where European leadership is not as much relevant is a telling story in and of itself. But clearly, I think the world is watching these elections, and the stakes have probably gotten even higher with the new vacancy on the Supreme Court. So what do you see, Kishore?
Well, I think I completely agree that there's a lot at stake in the elections within Trump. These elections are not just about the United States of America. These elections are also about the world. And I can't mention his name, but he's one of the most influential Europeans I know in Europe. He said to me in a private email, said, Kishore, if Trump is elected in November, brackets, as I expect him to be, close brackets, it's the end of the West as we know it. Because, at the end of the day, the West stood for, and Taslima has actually described the Western values very, very well. And in many ways, Trump is a denial of all those Western values, right? He doesn't care about anybody outside the United States of America. He says, let's make America great again. Not make the West great again, not make the world great again. It's about making America great again. And seriously, Europe should therefore think very hard about how it's going to survive another 4 years of Trump. And here, if you don't mind, as a friend of Europe, the best way I can be helpful to Europe is to say that Europe should stop being so cowardly. European leaders are so frightened of criticizing Trump. They disagree with him in private. They laugh about him in private, but they dare not criticize him. And going back to my very first point, the only way you show your support for human rights is not when you criticize somebody weaker than you, it's when you criticize somebody stronger than you. Taslima is very courageous because she's standing up to forces that are far more powerful than her, much more powerful than she is. She's showing great courage. But if the European leaders could show the same degree of courage as Taslima, they'd be criticizing Donald Trump and say, you don't represent what we stand for as representatives of the West. But I can, the former French ambassador to Washington, D.C., was asked by President Macron, as you know, at one stage Trump insulted Macron, and Macron consulted the French ambassador and said, what should I do? And the French ambassador said, no, don't reply. He will insult you even more, which means that Trump has the upper hand. Trump can criticize a European leader and no European leader dares to criticize him back. So that's the first point. And so the second point, of course, is what happens if Biden is elected. And of course, many Europeans want to believe that, hooray, the good times are back, we can go back to the good old days, everything will be the same. I would say, don't celebrate. Because at the end of the day, whether it's Trump or Biden, the United States is internally a deeply troubled society. And the two Princeton University economists, Case and Deaton, have described how there's a sea of despair among the white working classes. It is this sea of despair that is creating all this anger in the American body politic. And we have to address the anger in the American body politic because at the end of the day, Europe and frankly, even East Asia, we want to see a strong United States. We don't want to see a weak United States. We want to see a strong United States that's committed to some principles of the international order and a strong United States that can work with us to build a world order. But if Biden comes in, it doesn't mean all the problems are solved. So I would say at the end of the day, Europeans cannot assume that they can rely on the United States to provide leadership. And so Europeans should ask themselves, can we now provide the kind of leadership that the United States used to provide?
Well, I agree it should go beyond words of criticism, which are, in my opinion, very much merited, but also towards different kinds of cooperations. And some people have speculated about a more Eurasian kind of century and Eurasian cooperations. Is there an appetite for that in Asia?
Well, as you know, the main thesis of my writings is that the 21st century will be the Asian century. Now, I've been writing about this for 30 years. Mm-hmm. So far, I've been proven correct. Even today, in purchasing power parity terms, the number one economy in the world is China, number two is United States of America, number three is India, number four is Japan. Three of the top four already Asian. And there's absolutely no question that the 21st century will be the Asian century, because from the year 1 to the year 1800, for 1800, the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies were always those of China and India. So the last 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end. So you'll see the return of Asia. Next point, when the Asians have the strongest economies in the world, what kind of world will it be? That's a very big question.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is that you cannot answer it now because it's a world in transition. And just to give you one illustration, China will definitely become the number one economy in the world, for sure, no question. Now, how China will behave as number one in 2030, 10 years from now, it will depend on how you treat China in 2020. Now, as Napoleon said, let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. Now, China, as of now, has no desire to shake the world. But if you keep on insulting China, right, provoking China, doing things against China, then you're going to create a very angry Chinese nationalism. And one of the key goals of my book is to prevent an angry China from emerging. That let's try and work with China, because you cannot make China in your own image. That's a very unrealistic desire. And at the end of the day, if you want me to inject a bit of optimism inside here, one of the biggest gifts that the West, Europe and America gave to the world was the 1945 rules-based order. The UN Charter is a beautiful document. If you try to write the UN Charter today, it'd be impossible. You'll be negotiating like hell. You won't get a beautiful document like UN Charter. As of today, right? As of September 2020, China is still committed to the 1945 rules-based order. Let us try to keep China on board with that. Because if China leaves the 1945 rules-based order, then I'm afraid it will be a much more difficult one.
How do you see this, Taslima, the US election for the topics that you care about, and the question of leadership in the space of women's and human rights, and when it erodes, how does it impact other parts of the world? And does it give legitimization to those leaders who weren't too keen to respect those universal rights or broader set of rules that Kishore talked about anyway?
You know, I think that Joe Biden will win because Trump is already hated by Mexicans, and there are also immigrants who do not like Trump, and also feminists and women also do not like Trump because he is a misogynist. He abused many women. Recently, another woman came and said that how she was sexually abused by Trump. So Trump is a big threat. You know, I think that in the United States there are so many immigrants live, and then there is no reason for them to vote Trump because of the Islamic, that he could far right. If the far right politicians come to power, they will control Muslim fanatics, Muslim terrorists. They will, not allow Muslims to come to United States. That was the reason that Trump got popular. So I think that now there is no fear. Or less fear. I think that they have seen that how Trump ruled the country. He was really, really bad, and I think that it is better for the world if Biden comes to power. And also, I'm happy that Kamala Harris is there. She was half Indian, and I think that lots of Indian people live in the United States, and they will get votes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's definitely one of the most historic elections that the world has ever seen, and certainly all over the world people are watching with both anxiety and hopes, I presume. One of the topics that I work on quite a bit is questions of disinformation, the public debate as it unfolds, and how, the whole online dynamic changes the way in which people engage, and the way in which there can also be manipulation of the elections and the electoral process. And what I think has been very interesting recently, and also in the dynamic between China, the United States, and India is the question of, who gets access, which apps can be downloaded, and what are the new rules, what is the rules-based order, if you will, when it comes to the whole digital domain, where human rights are at stake in new ways, where battles for trust and leadership are fought out in different ways. Perhaps I can ask each of you for some closing reflections on how the whole digital domain changes relations of power, changes the situation of human rights, and any last thoughts that you may want to share before we close this session, which I think we could have gone on for a long time, but we have to come to a conclusion. So Kishore, can you say a few things about this whole digital layer to the geopolitical battles that we're discussing?
Yeah, I must say I'm really, really glad that you raised the issue of social media, because I think it's going to lead to a profound transformation of the human condition in ways that I think we cannot anticipate fully. Last year, when I went to Vancouver in April to give my TED Talk, it was the first TED Talk I gave. The lady who spoke on the first day is someone who you probably know. She's a British journalist called Carol
Cadwell. Yeah.
And if you get a chance, please watch her TED Talk. It's amazing. And the people who basically fed lies to the British people, lies which led to Brexit happening, was not Chinese intelligence, was not Russian intelligence. It was Facebook. And false ads giving lies. And when Carol Cadwell went to Facebook and said, "Can I please see the ads that people have seen?" And she showed us them. Facebook said, no, they disappeared. We cannot go. So you cannot find the lies that were told to the people that led to the disaster of Brexit. And why did Facebook do it? For money, right? For money. And so so what is destroying democracy, therefore, and this is a key point I want to emphasize, it's not a foreign force. It's something internally. And this goes back to my key point about plutocracy. That when people with lots and lots of money are able not just, to use their money to accumulate wealth for themselves, but to distort the political debate, provide lies to people, and then not be regulated in any kind of way. And if you want me to leave one note of optimism, I would say that the European Union is the greatest regulatory power in the world. It's got economic muscle to do regulations. And if the European Union can come up with regulations that can control Google, Facebook, Baidu, everybody else, the world will be very grateful to Europe.
Taslima, any thoughts on this new battlefield?
Actually, many of my books are banned by Bangladesh government, and my writings are censored all the time, everywhere. So I thought that social media or internet, I can publish my work and people can read. But in social media nowadays, there are in India, Bangladesh, and other countries also, there are, laws against free speech on social media. If I criticize Islam, then I will be caught. The Facebook will remove my articles, and there are laws. I could be punished. So in digital world also there is a limitation. We cannot express our views, especially about Islam. We can criticize Christianity, Judaism, and all other religions, but not Islam. So I think that to civilize Muslim world, or to secularize Muslim world, we need to criticize the, Islam, especially Islamic oppression against women, and also that, Islamic ideas against human rights. We have to criticize, otherwise we will not be able to secularize, Muslim society. Or also Muslims should also learn about, the other opinions. Only they are allowed to have only one opinion, what is, that is written in the Quran and Hadith. But there are other opinions against it. So those other opinions are not welcomed even in digital media, even in Facebook, Twitter. We get. I wrote about Islam today. Some people are telling me that maybe it will be deleted by Facebook. Maybe your ID will be gone. So if we don't have freedom on digital world, then where can we get the freedom? Because we need to speak so that the other people would learn and would be, because they are brainwashed with the Quran and Hadith. They have to, that there should be free thinkers. If free thinkers are not allowed to express their views, then Muslim society will never be educated, never be civilized, never be secularized. So in Europe, when Christianity, there is a Inquisition, there is, time, and then so many blasphemers or atheists were killed. So now Islamic Inquisition is going on. So this has to be stopped. And if in Europe, in Christian world, they had the opportunity to criticize their Christianity. They had the opportunity to criticize church, so that the people become, they could separate state and religion. But in Muslim world, we need to separate state and religion. Otherwise Muslim laws which are against women will remain there. Sharia laws, women would be victim of Sharia laws. We need modern secular laws. We need to secularize Islamic world. But if we are always banned and censored, but if in social media, if we do not have that freedom, then I think that then it is not good for Muslim world or not any kind of society. I think free speech is urgently necessary for all society to make a better world.
I think it's a very important rallying cry to end on. We went in this conversation about an outsider's perspective on Europe from the question of what the impact of migration has been and whether the socioeconomic model of the Europeans is better to absorb some of the shocks that we see now as a result of COVID-19 and the economic fallout, but also the political shockwaves that certainly we can observe in the United States, and questions about how these democratic battles, but also global power battles are playing out, and the many, many shifts and changes that we're seeing, not only between nation states and governments and the interests that they are seeking to advance, but also the sort of power battles that we touched upon just now in terms of who gets to set the rules for the digital world and what impact does that have when it comes to geopolitics and human rights and fundamental freedom. So I think that the scope of many, many things at stake in the world, with or without Europe, has been very rich. I hope we can revisit at some point in the future to see how things have evolved. It's clear that change is happening very rapidly, and that from power questions and security questions to individual security and the position of women and human rights defenders, there's a lot at stake. So I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us online and for joining us for this discussion as part of the Forum on European Culture. Thank you very much also to the audiences who've watched us online from many parts of the world. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.